Item
Brittany.
7 is an informational briefing by Commission staff on the topic of lower cost overnight accommodations in the coastal zone. Staff will be providing an overview of the Coastal Act requirements related to lower cost overnight accommodations, including how the Commission typically assesses impacts to existing lower cost accommodations and encourages new lower cost overnight opportunities on the coast. This briefing will also cover the concept of in lieu fees, which the Commission is typically required in cases where lower cost accommodations could not be feasibly provided either on-site or as part of a targeted off-site project. Next slide, please. More specifically, the purpose of today's briefing is to provide an overview of the Commission's current approaches to protecting and providing lower cost overnight accommodations in the coastal zone, and also to present details on the in lieu fee calculation for the Commission's consideration today. Commission staff's last briefing on the matter was in 2016, and staff believes it is important for the Commission and public to have an understanding of the Commission's approach and some recent challenges that have been encountered. This item will begin with a staff presentation on lower cost overnight accommodations, including the regulatory background, applicability, strategies for implementation, as well as examples from previous Commission actions. After that, we will take public comment on this topic, followed by Commission discussion. Commissioners will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback on the issues discussed today, but we are not asking you to take any action. And with that, I will turn it over to our two presenters today, Brittany Casalino, a supervisor in our statewide planning unit, and Shahar Amate, a coastal planner also from our statewide planning unit.
Thank you, Shanna. Next slide, please. A range of overnight accommodations are currently available in the coastal zone, including hotels, motels, hostels, campgrounds, RV sites, and more. Certain types of accommodations, like campgrounds and hostels, tend to be inherently lower cost. Others, such as hotels and motels, may be lower cost, especially if they are older or more simple structures or have fewer amenities. While some areas of the state have a fair number of such lower cost accommodations, others have virtually none. In addition to encouraging various types of accommodations that are inherently lower cost, the Commission has also recently considered how programming can provide additional opportunities for people to stay overnight on the coast who might not otherwise be able to do so. For example, market rate hotels have sometimes provided a certain number of discounted rooms per year to nonprofit organizations that bring groups to the coast as part of their programs. Next slide, please. Lower cost overnight accommodations generally mean those that are priced low enough to be accessible to lower and middle income coastal visitors. Having a sufficient supply of lower cost overnight accommodations on the coast is a significant part of ensuring equitable access to coastal resources, which is a foundational pillar of the Coastal Act. There has been a severe reduction in the availability of lower cost accommodations and significant market pressure to develop new higher cost accommodations statewide in the coastal zone, especially over the past few decades, which makes it increasingly difficult for visitors with limited means to access the coast, especially for those who travel from inland locations and cannot easily make a round trip to the coast in a single day. Protecting and providing lower cost facilities thus helps remove some of the barriers to access and maximizes public access and recreation on the coast. Also, as the Commission is acutely aware, the history of exclusionary housing practices and the current shortage of affordable housing in the coastal zone has forced many households of color and lower incomes to live further inland. While addressing the housing issues in the coastal zone is a separate and complex topic, providing lower cost overnight accommodations is an important aspect of maximizing coastal access opportunities for such communities. Next slide, please. Providing visitor serving and recreational uses, particularly lower cost ones, is a high priority under the Coastal Act. The Commission's main authority for protecting and providing lower cost overnight facilities is established by Coastal Act Section 30210, which requires coastal access and recreational opportunities to be maximized for all people, and by Coastal Act Section 30213, which requires that lower cost and recreational facilities be protected, encouraged, and where feasible, provided. The Commission's environmental justice policy further supports these Coastal Act mandates by stating that the Commission shall strive for a no net loss of lower cost facilities in the coastal zone while implementing a longer term strategy to increase the number and variety of new lower cost opportunities. Next slide. While Coastal Act Section 30213 has strong protections for existing lower cost overnight accommodations, one of the main challenges of applying this policy is that the provision of new lower cost overnight accommodations at a particular site hinges on feasibility. Feasibility takes economic, environmental, social, technical, and practical factors into account, and it can be difficult to fully analyze whether providing lower cost facilities is indeed feasible or not. Section 30213 also has two restrictions, which are shown on the right. The first restricts the commission from setting room rates. While the commission cannot require an applicant to set room rates at a specific amount, the commission has in past cases worked with applicants to encourage lower cost accommodations on site wherever feasible. The second restriction prohibits the establishment or approval of any method for identifying low or moderate income persons for the purpose of determining eligibility for overnight rooms. This means that the commission cannot propose or approve any methodology that would identify and exclude certain groups over others. However, in the past, the commission has approved marketing plans that help ensure that lower cost accommodations are advertised to certain underserved communities as a means to increase awareness of their availability. Next slide, please. To provide some background and context for 30213 implementation, it's important to point out a few key policy developments that have occurred since the previous commission workshops on this topic, which were held in 2014, 2015, and 2016. At that time, the workshops compiled information from staff research, panelist presentations, and commission deliberation to identify approaches to protecting and providing for lower cost overnight accommodations in the coastal zone. Subsequent to these workshops, AB 2616 amended the Coastal Act to give the Commission authority to advance environmental justice in its permitting and planning decisions. In 2019, the Commission officially adopted its environmental justice policy, which, as mentioned before, calls for a no net loss of visitor serving facilities and an increase in the number and variety of new lower cost opportunities. In addition, the Coastal Act was amended by AB 2050 in 2017, giving the Commission authority to redirect fees that were collected in lieu of providing lower cost overnight accommodations to a different entity if they have gone unspent for 7 years. AB 250 also called for the Coastal Conservancy to develop a program for improving and creating lower cost overnight accommodations within 1.5 miles of the coast. The Coastal Conservancy completed its Explore the Coast Overnight study in 2019, which led to the creation of the Conservancy's Explore the Coast Overnight grant program and the Commission's Memorandum of Understanding with the Conservancy, about directing in lieu fees to that program. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Commission staff's analysis in the last workshop series found that nearly 70% of all hotel rooms eliminated from the coastal zone between 1989 and 2016 were economy rate rooms, whereas less than 10% of the rooms lost were in the upscale or luxury categories. The Coastal Conservancy's Explore the Coast Overnight study found that only about 21% of existing hotel rooms qualify as lower cost, and that figure is rapidly dwindling, especially in light of the fact that a large portion of these remaining lower cost facilities are in private ownership and are thus at risk of conversion to higher cost facilities. On the other hand, statewide demand for lower cost accommodations in the coastal zone continues to be very high. And while difficult to quantify, lower cost hotels, camping, and hostel occupancy rates in the coastal zone often exceed 70% and can reach as high as 97% in high demand areas during the peak summer season. So together, these factors help explain why a 2017 Coastal Conservancy study found that over 45% of Californians said that overnight accommodations at the coast were inconvenient or unaffordable, and that low and middle income households, people of color, and young people are less likely than higher income, white, or older Californians to stay overnight at the California coast. And I'll now turn it over to Shahar on Zoom.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Next slide, please. Given the language in section 302.3 about protection of lower cost facilities, the Commission has generally not allowed existing lower cost overnight accommodations to be removed, or if they would be removed, has required a one-to-one replacement. The Commission's approach to the loss of moderate cost overnight accommodations has varied. Typically, the Commission has also required that any development of new higher cost units provide 25% of the rooms or units at lower cost. Requiring that at least 25% of new units are lower cost helps provide a range of opportunities for visitors of all incomes. Although the Commission could, and sometimes has, used a different percentage based on on-site specific circumstances, it has most often used the 25% figure. This is in line with the findings in the Conservancy's Explore the Coast overnight study and Smith Travel Researchers data, which estimate that this percentage approximately constitutes the current proportion of lower cost overnight accommodations in the coastal zone. Next slide, please. To implement both the protection of existing lower cost units and the provision of new lower cost units, the Commission first has to define what is and what is not a lower cost unit. It is important to note that we should not confuse the term lower cost with affordability. Affordability is in the eye of the beholder and is related to someone's specific ability to pay and or income level, whereas the Coastal Act uses the term lower cost, which describes the nature of the facility in question and cost in relation to other facilities. Historically, the Commission has used methodologies to provide price thresholds for each cost group shown on this slide: lower, moderate, and higher cost. For example, in the 1980s, a fixed amount was used to determine whether a hotel was lower cost. In the early 2000s, a more site-specific approach was used by comparing the average cost of economy hotels in a specific market area to the statewide average. At its 2016 workshop, the Commission considered a methodology for determining lower cost based on findings from its consultant at the time that created a 10-step process based on specific market data. Unfortunately, this methodology was complex and relied on data that is not always available in certain market areas. As a result, a simpler method was identified in which the lower and higher cost thresholds represent a percentage of the statewide average room rate. Specifically, 75% represents the lower cost threshold, so rates that are less than or equal to 75% of the statewide average could be considered lower cost. And 125% represents the higher cost threshold, so rates that are greater than or equal to 125% of the statewide average could be considered higher cost. Anything in between is considered moderate cost. This approach is known as the statewide method, and it reflects Coastal Conservancy findings that lower cost coastal accommodations typically fall under 75% of the statewide average room rate. In some cases, these thresholds may be adjusted to account for higher occupancy rooms above 2 guests. The Commission has also considered a regional method in some cases, which looks at the rates of hotels categorized as economy and luxury in a defined market area, such as a city or county. The statewide method has been the preferred approach as it is more in line with environmental justice principles in that rates should reflect what people from all across the state can afford rather than market-specific rates that tend to be higher in places like Southern California and the Central Coast. In addition, the regional method relies on prospective applicants to purchase the regional data from Smith Travel Research or a comparable data source, whereas the data needed for the statewide method is readily available to the Commission and project applicants. Next slide, please. When determining whether an applicant can provide lower cost rooms as part of their project, staff often request a feasibility study from the developer. The feasibility study's primary goal is to evaluate whether providing lower cost accommodations is or is not feasible, including a thorough analysis of land value, development costs, estimated annual revenue based on projected average daily room rates and occupancy rates, and estimated operating costs. Feasibility studies should also discuss other issues like development constraints, financial constraints, and the provision of amenities such as kitchenettes, fitness centers, pools and spas, bike and kayak rentals, improved public access, and discounts. The Commission has focused on 3 primary methods to protect existing and provide new lower cost accommodations. First, the Commission aims to ensure a certain number or percentage of lower cost accommodations are provided on site as part of the proposed project. Or, if not feasible, then ensuring an equivalent number of lower cost units are created off-site. If this is also not feasible, then the Commission ensures in lieu fees are paid to help create an equivalent amount of new lower cost accommodations elsewhere. Typically, the Commission has prioritized these options in the order as shown on the slide, and each of these options may be appropriate under certain conditions. The chosen approach for each project is highly dependent on the site-specific circumstances, and the results of the feasibility study may even be a combination of the approaches, such as that approved in the Highgate Hotel example in Laguna Beach, where 6 units were approved on-site along with some funding that went directly off-site to the Crystal Cove cottages nearby. The following slides discuss some examples of each method, as well as some of the challenges and opportunities associated with each method. Next slide, please. Shown on the slide are examples of Commission-approved projects that provide lower-cost overnight accommodations on-site. On our public website, you can find additional projects where the Commission authorized on-site lower-cost units. There are numerous benefits to providing lower-cost units directly on-site. On-site provision ensures compliance with Section 30213 requirements by providing a range of affordability. It helps ensure that lower-cost overnight accommodations will be built in a timely manner. It avoids the risk that visitor-serving uses will only be for the benefit of the wealthy, and it advances the Commission's environmental justice policy by maximizing opportunities for underserved and lower-income communities to visit the coast. For these reasons, on-site provision has been the preferred approach in the past. On the other hand, there are a few important challenges with providing lower-cost units directly on-site. It is not always practically or economically feasible, and it can often be difficult to guarantee that the lower cost units are actually used by the intended audiences, given that the Commission may not approve a method to identify lower and moderate income persons that qualify to use the units. To address these challenges, the Commission has often required marketing plans to advertise these lower cost rooms to the intended audience, as well as monitoring and auditing requirements to ensure that the facility is compliant in offering the lower cost accommodations. Next slide, please. Recently, the Commission has explored another option that dedicates a certain number of rooms for a certain number of nights at lower cost rates through programs that directly engage with underserved communities. These quote-unquote room nights can be considered a subset of providing lower cost overnight accommodations directly on site. So, for example, the Commission recently approved the American Tin Cannery Hotel in Pacific Grove, which will provide at least 300 room nights per year at no or lower cost to programs that serve school groups, lower income individuals, and other underserved communities. The main benefit of this approach is that the programs with which the hotel would partner could ensure that lower cost rooms would be available to those whom the Commission would like most to reach. Such programs can sometimes include food, educational activities, and other elements that support the guest stay and further enhance coastal access and recreational opportunities. Next slide, please. The Commission has also allowed for off-site provision of lower cost overnight accommodations, such as the Wayfarer hostel shown here, which was a direct off-site requirement of constructing the Hilton Resort in Santa Barbara. While this option ensures that real lower cost units are provided in a timely manner, it is not always a viable option given site constraints and feasibility issues. From an enforcement perspective, it can also be difficult to understand which entity should be held accountable if the rates are out of conformance with the Commission's approval. Next slide, please. The Commission has also required in lieu fee payments that are collected from the developer of a higher cost hotel project to then fund lower cost overnight accommodations, programs, and opportunities somewhere else. The Commission has mostly employed this option only if it is infeasible to directly provide lower cost units on-site or off-site. This slide shows several examples of projects that have been constructed with in lieu fees. In lieu fees are directed to a third-party entity rather than collected by the Commission directly. In the past, the Commission and applicants have partnered with various organizations to ensure that in lieu fees are disbursed and applied in a manner that adequately funds intended projects. As shown on the slide, in lieu fees have gone to various lower cost overnight projects, ranging from expansion of a hostel in Santa Monica to children's camps to various campgrounds statewide. The commission often works with state parks and the Coastal Conservancy through a memoranda of understanding, as well as with Hostling International, Mountain Recreation Conservation Authority, and other similar entities to spend the in lieu fees in a timely manner on programs that would maximize public access and recreation on the coast. Next slide, please. As shown on the slide, the commission's required in lieu fees have already been spent on at least $22.9 million worth of lower cost overnight projects and programming. An additional $19.2 million is available to be spent, and over half of that amount is earmarked for a specified target project. Approximately $8 million is currently available without a target project in mind. This does not include an additional $18 million or so the commission has required in several recent projects that will become available in the near future once the permit is issued for those projects. Still, there are several challenges with the current approach of calculating and collecting in lieu fees. First, the concept of in lieu fees introduces a third party into the process. And to manage that, the commission has imposed permit conditions and entered into memoranda of understanding that specify how, when, and where funds can be spent. In addition, viable future projects can take a very long time to go through early planning and environmental review before in lieu fees can be spent on actual construction. Finally, the in lieu fees required by the commission have not been on par with actual development costs, which have recently ballooned. So many of the collected funds have not been able to be spent on viable projects because they do not fully cover development costs as they were originally intended. Next slide, please. To summarize, the commission's approach has been to require on-site provision of lower cost overnight accommodations in association with a new high-cost project. And if this is not feasible, provide such units off-site as a first alternative. Where a study demonstrates that neither is feasible, the payment of an in lieu fee is considered. In 2015, the fee was calculated to be $100,000 per hotel room based on a 2014 construction cost estimate for an example hostel project provided by Hostling International that was affirmed by the commission's lower cost accommodations consultant at the time. The commission has since been adjusting that per room fee by the Turner Building Cost Index to account for inflation. At present, this equates to approximately $149,311 per room, or $150,000, not including land costs. In some recent cases, like the American Tin Cannery Hotel in Pacific Grove and the Ocean Avenue Hotel in Santa Monica, the commission has considered how this calculation of in lieu fees is insufficient to cover the full costs of development, and as a result, has considered site-specific development cost estimates to inform a more realistic in lieu fee. In a 2023 commission action for the Ocean Avenue Hotel project in Santa Monica, 120 rooms were offered at market rate. So commission staff initially analyzed an in lieu fee for 25% of the market rate rooms, which totaled to about $4.3 million. The applicants coordinated with staff in Hostling International to prioritize directing the in lieu fee to a targeted nearby hostel expansion project in Santa Monica that would provide a comparable amount of lower cost units in the vicinity. However, the expansion of the Santa Monica hostel was estimated by Hostling International to cost almost double the value of the calculated in lieu fee, and thus the in lieu fee would not have been sufficient to fully fund the project. To help address the shortfall, the commission imposed a higher in lieu fee at the hearing. I will now kick it back to Brittany for some closing discussion.
Thanks, Jahar. Next slide, please. Slide 18, please. Thank you. To address the issue of our in lieu fee calculation not keeping up with actual development costs, staff is currently working with Hostling International to update its 2014 cost estimate using the same base assumptions to provide a current day cost estimate. This update is still being finalized, but is anticipated to be about double the original estimate, or about $300,000 per room in current value, which really underscores how much development costs have changed in the past decade. Staff also believes that using a California-specific index called the California Construction Cost Index, rather than the nationwide Turner Building Cost Index, will better reflect the inflation that we see in California. The California Index is based on the average building cost indices for San Francisco and Los Angeles, whereas the Turner Building Cost Index is based on nationwide averages. Staff also believes that it is generally appropriate to add a 10% administrative fee, which is reflective of the minimum admin costs for the Coastal Conservancy, state parks, or other entity to manage these funds and the projects that they go towards. The commission could also consider adding land acquisition costs as another element for in lieu fees. Staff believes it is appropriate to add land costs where it is deemed necessary to support development of new lower cost overnight accommodations. In past cases where staff initially contemplated incorporating land costs into the overall in lieu fee calculation, subsequent coordination with hotel developers and local governments has led to identification of target projects on already viable parcels that are held by entities such as state parks, Hosteling International, or MRCA. So in such cases, staff ultimately did not recommend that land costs be included because they were not needed to support the target project. The commission also often directs in lieu fees to the Coastal Conservancy's grant program under our MOU, and the Conservancy is not a landholding entity themselves, but their grant program does support acquisition projects. So since it is not always known in advance who will actually be accepting the required in lieu fees or what projects they will be directed to, the commission could instead take the approach of generally including land costs, but allowing these costs to be subtracted out from the final in lieu fee payment if the applicant can demonstrate that it is not necessary to support project development. One method of calculating land costs that the commission has approved for Barrio Logan and just yesterday for the Otay Mesa Nestor community in San Diego was based on the average cost per square footage of commercial land sales over the past 5 years. Another element that the commission could consider adding to in lieu fees is the operation costs for new lower cost units. While the commission has not previously considered operation costs in its in lieu fee calculations, this element would ensure that the lower cost accommodations funded by the in lieu fees could remain open and available to the public over the long term. Lastly, as has been mentioned, some hotel projects offer a certain amount of nights per year at no or lower cost through programming. This sort of programming could be considered when calculating total in lieu fees and when assessing applicants' proposals to meet Section 30213 requirements. The commission could consider programming as a credit towards the final in lieu fee amount, or in certain cases, the commission could alternatively view programming as directly providing lower cost accommodations on site. As Shahar mentioned, in lieu fees are an important tool in the commission's toolbox for Section 30213 compliance because providing lower cost units on site or off site is not always feasible. Continuing to update and apply these in lieu fee elements where appropriate is an important piece of ensuring that these funds can be successfully spent on expanding lower cost overnight opportunities along our coast. Updating in lieu fees to fully cover the cost of development can also help minimize the temporal loss aspect that we see with in lieu fees that have gone unspent for some time, while the associated higher cost projects move forward. Next slide, please. There are several recent examples that showcase how commission actions have evolved on the issue of in lieu fees, including how to calculate them and when it is appropriate to require them. As mentioned earlier, for instance, in its recent action on the 225-room American Tincanary Hotel in Pacific Grove, the commission approved at least 300 room nights per year at no or lower cost to programs that serve school groups, lower income individuals, and other underserved communities. In addition to this programming, the project will include 18 lower cost hotel rooms and 16 lower cost hostel rooms on site. The commission found that this was an adequate package for compliance with Section 30213 and did not require an in lieu fee. In the case of the Dana Point Harbor Hotels, for which the commission approved an LCP amendment just last month, the commission found that $3.8 million in lower cost overnight programming would be needed to complement the on-site provision of 136 moderate cost rooms and 33 lower cost rooms for a total package that would maximize public access on public tidelands, especially to underserved communities who would greatly benefit from these opportunities. Finally, in the case of the Ocean Avenue Hotel in Santa Monica just last December, the commission found that the conventional in lieu fee calculation, which would have come out to $4.3 million at the time, would fall short of providing tangible lower cost overnight accommodations at the nearby Santa Monica hostel based on site-specific development cost estimates. And as mentioned, the commission thus worked out a higher in lieu fee with the applicants at the hearing. These cases show how the commission has recently adapted to changing market conditions and ever-increasing development costs. So the goal of this briefing is to highlight these changing circumstances and take stock on how, moving forward, the commission will continue to respond to challenges and barriers in providing lower cost overnight accommodations on the coast. Next slide. That concludes staff's presentation. Staff is asking for the commission's feedback on lower cost overnight accommodations in general. And we particularly welcome feedback on these two elements on the slide here, the prioritization and provision of lower cost accommodations on-site, off-site, or through in lieu fees, as well as the elements to include in future in lieu fee calculations. Staff is available for questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cozzolino, Mr. Emete. Again, I'm still trying to figure out where that background is from because of the palm tree. Did you say it was Big Sur, but then it has the palm tree?
McWay Falls.
With the palm tree?
Yep.
Okay. All right, moving right along. All right, so let's open public comment. How many speakers do we have on this item?
We have 4 speakers for this item. We have 1 in the room, Donna Martinez, and then 3 online.
Okay, we'll have 2 minutes for each.
Donna Martinez.
What is happening? Sorry. I should be on mute. What is happening?
Good morning, commissioners. I'm Donna Martinez. I am a vacation home owner in the Sea Ranch and a founding board member of the recently established 501c6 organization, Sonoma County Coalition of Hosts. I am here to speak to 3 critical reasons vacation rentals must remain available on our coastline as viable means of accomplishing the Coastal Commission's mission that of providing lower cost access to our incredible shores. First, vacation rentals provide affordable accommodations for families and groups to stay together. They are often less expensive than other types of lodging. For families with children and older relatives making trips to the coast, a vacation rental provides a safe, family-friendly environment. Second, vacation rentals help the homeowners to stay living on the coast as costs around them increase. The ability to rent one's home to visitors on the coast occasionally when they are not in residence provides much needed income. This is often the case for seniors such as us who wish to age in our homes. Third, and perhaps most essentially to the issues at hand, these are homes such as ours, individually and privately owned. They are not, as some fear, commodities to be snapped up by callous investors. In fact, accessible census data on second homes in Sonoma County, where I reside, shows seasonal or recreational use homes, the category that short-term rentals fall under, decreased in number between 2012 and 2022. Moreover, the number of second homes has decreased while owner-occupied units increased. All of this is to say that the panic around investors buying up homes and displacing full-time residents is misplaced. Rather, we should be focused on housing production. The census tells us that the total number of units in our county has stagnated, with only slightly more units total in 2022 than there were 10 years previously. The bottom line, we need more housing, not scapegoating of the short-term rental operators like me. Furthermore, though the study that led to the development of the lower cost overnight accommodations report did not consider coastal accommodations at private residences through short-term rentals, my experience shows that has been one of the many main ways for others to access our craggy shores and benefit from its healing powers. Thank you.
Thank you. Our remaining speakers are on Zoom. We'll start with James Breen, followed by Pamela Hetherington, and then Vicky Silva. James Breen.
Hi, good morning, Honorable Chair Hart and Commissioners. My name is James Brine, and I'm speaking on behalf of Unite Here. We wanted to take this opportunity to summarize some of our members' advocacy around low-cost accommodations over the years. For more than a decade or so, our members have been advocating for the goals of the Coastal Act because while many of them serve wealthy guests at coastal resorts, they are not able to live, work, or play in these same coastal communities. Secondly, our members work in hotels, and they are uniquely suited to identify when bad actors run afoul of the Coastal Act. To this end, we have been proud to work with the staff and the commission to make tremendous contributions to low-cost accommodations in the coastal zone. Perhaps most notably, in 2015, hotel workers came forward as whistleblowers in the case of the Shore Hotel in Santa Monica, which had illegally displaced 2 low-cost motels and replaced it with the luxury Shore Hotel. In that case, a coalition of workers and coastal advocates won a settlement of 14 lower-cost rooms, 72 moderate-cost rooms, a $2.3 million in lieu fee, and a record $15.5 million enforcement settlement. Other significant victories from our members' advocacy include the Pacific Edge Hotel in Laguna Beach, which contributed 25% affordable rooms on site. The recently approved Ocean Avenue project in Santa Monica, which has been mentioned, contributed over $6 million to expand the nearby hostel. And the consent order involving the Paradise Point Resort in San Diego that required the removal of unpermitted development and over $2 million of public access mitigations. These victories are possible when the commission considers the input of people like our members in considering the unique circumstances of each project that comes before you. And we will continue to work with the commission to make the coast equitable for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Pamela Hetherington.
Good morning, commissioners, and thank you for your attention to our public tidelands. I have just a couple of comments or questions, actually. How does this sync with the public tideland trust doctrine when we're putting hotels in public tidelands in perpetuity? How will you gauge that they are fulfilling their requirements for low cost and moderate cost visitors serving accommodation? My second concern is how are you going to adjust the fees going forward? I see the staff has done a good job today in explaining and updating how the commission can raise more in lieu fees. But how are you going to be looking at this going forward? Are you going to look at it yearly, decadally? We're far behind now in actually coming up with twice as much in lieu fees. So I want to make sure that the commission is on top of it going forward so that we're not going backwards. I do have concerns in San Diego because our public trust tidelands are being abused. And I just wish that the Attorney General's office would have a public trust doctrine department to oversee and help you in administering your role at 30213, because it's important. I just recently tried to do a staycation in San Diego, and I cannot afford any of the offerings that I searched. So it is important for those of us that are on fixed incomes and those that are, how can I say it, deprived of coastal access to be at the forefront of all your considerations. And I thank you for the great job that you're doing.
Thank you. And then our last speaker is Vicky Silva. I'm not seeing Vicky in the meeting. If you can raise your hand. Oh, I see Hector Azpilcueta, who I also believe is from Unite Here. I'm allowing you to speak. Please unmute and say your name.
Good morning. Thank you for all your hard work. I'm going to speak from my heart because I live in the community. I work for high-end hotels and I'm just a number. You know what? I'm never going to be able to stay at the hotels that I worked for. I'm 51 years old. I'm going to die not knowing what it's like to stay at one of the hotels that I have worked for, my family has worked for. I don't know. Anyway, I'm speaking from my heart. And I hope that you guys really consider everything that's being said and being brought forward to you guys. And I know that you don't like things being repeated for me to say the same thing as someone else has said, but just take everything into consideration. I second the motion of everyone from Local 19, Local 11, and just know that I'm just one person. I don't live near you. I'm not near you. I'm in Monterey, Santa Cruz. And I have been working in hospitality for so many years, but I've never stayed at the hotels that I work for. And if I have not stayed in one of the hotels that I work for, I'm never going to be able to stay. I'm going to die and not stay where I work. And we workers like us have proudly advocated for goals for the Coastal Act of many years. Some of us have even risked our own jobs to do so. Yes, that's very true. As a result, we have worked with the commissions to fight for the highest standards, such as the requirements for hotels to set 25% of their rooms as lower cost, as you saw yesterday with the Magnolia Tank Farm. We push for this because people who live paycheck to, you have to hear that. You have to give me another minute. People who work paycheck to paycheck, like myself, should have the opportunity to go on vacation and stay on the coast after months of hard work. One project you will hear about is coming months.
I'm willing to give the speaker one more minute, please.
You can unmute again. Vicky.
Thank you. One project you will hear about in the coming months is the Santa Cruz Hotel. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and it's sad to know that I'm going to be just a number and never be able to stay there, not even one night. I would not be able to afford to stay there, or my family members, if any. I just had a brother that passed away, and we were sleeping in cars. We were sleeping, and we just couldn't afford it. But I just hope that you take all this into consideration to make rooms affordable for people like me that have given everything for this community. Without us, you wouldn't have hotels to be renting. You wouldn't have people cleaning rooms. You wouldn't have people taking out garbage, linen. That's the stuff that you guys don't see. I see it every day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. No more speakers.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to bring it back to staff, and then we'll open it up for commission comments.
Thank you. I'd just like to respond to the questions posed by our third speaker. I'm sorry, I missed your name. Thanks. So on the topic of ensuring that hotels on public tidelands are providing the lower cost accommodations that they initially come forward with over the longer term. You saw a great example of this from the Dana Point Harbor Hotel just last month. The commission LCP action required both monitoring and reporting requirements for this to ensure that these lower cost rates that were proposed for both the replacement and the new hotel would be provided going forward. And this is a standard practice that we apply to hotel CDP and LCP actions widely. On the question about keeping our in-lieu fee up to date, we hope that applying this California specific construction cost index will address this issue that we've seen over the past 10 years with our in-lieu fee not keeping up with the cost of construction, even though that was accounting for inflation using the nationwide construction cost index. Since this California specific index will better reflect the inflation costs that we see in this state. And staff can also continue to evaluate the in-lieu fee as a whole going forward.
Ms. Gray?
Just wanted to add a couple more comments. I really appreciate the public commenters and their concerns. And I want, as you know, the commission's program encourages a range of types of accommodations and levels of affordability. And we're talking about lower costs today, but we try to look at it as a little bit of everything, right? So short-term rentals, hostels, hotels, that all makes up that package of overnight accommodations on the coast. So we hadn't intended to go into any one particular type of use today, but really talk about hopefully like the on-site, off-site provision of lower cost accommodations, as well as the fee calculation, which is really important as conditions change. And of course, today we have the luxury, we don't have an action before us, so we're hoping to get as much feedback as possible, all things lower cost accommodations. But we really wanted to let everybody know that we do have some challenges. California's changing. And so, as Brittany said, we'd like to, keep this going and update the costs on a more regular basis and have these types of review.
Just want to
Yeah,
make one quick
gotcha.
addition, if you
Sure,
don't
of
mind.
course, of course.
Again, I think, the last speaker we heard from really underscores some of the challenges that this commission faces, that we in general in California are facing in accommodations and housing. The cost of living, the cost of existing in California is going up in that even higher at a faster rate on the coast. And so we are trying to maintain accommodations for all people that are accessible. And that's a really hard thing to do. So we are, again, what we'd like some feedback from you all is, this is the approach we've been working on. Obviously, we will always look case by case, and that's not going to change. But we want, we need a little bit more feedback from you all to help us in negotiations with future projects, with understanding sort of how you all see this playing out on the coast and what our role is, and how we can best effectuate low-cost accommodation on the coast. And I have to acknowledge too that as Shahar pointed out, low-cost accommodation is not connected directly to affordability. And so just pointing that out, it's why we've really focused on providing a variety of types of accommodations, and we look at all types, from camping to hostels to all the different ways that people look at the coast. So again, a lot of challenges in front of us, and just looking for feedback from you all on if there's things that we're missing, or if you want us to look, think of a different approach, or you like the approach we're taking, or anything along those lines. Would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Huckelbridge. All right, bring it back to the commission. Start with Commissioner Nuttall, and then I'm sure everyone. will
Yeah,
express what they're saying.
I wonder if you could put that slide up on the priorities that you're using now and that you wanted feedback on. That would be helpful to see. I generally support the priorities of trying to get on site first. One thing that I wanted to just ask a little bit more about is protecting existing low cost facilities. So, for example, I think in San Simeon, they've turned some low cost motels into high cost resorts. And so what are we doing to at least protect what we have now? Because I think, my general response is low cost visitor serving, we need more of it. But the first thing is we shouldn't be losing what we have. So what's the experience been of protecting what we have? I'm thinking Santa Monica in particular has been a place that's really, we've seen a lot of conversions there. And is there more authority that the commission should be seeking to enable us to protect what we have now?
Yeah, this is part of our program right now to protect those existing units. A lot of times what we do is when a proposal comes in, we work with them directly to try to keep those units on site. If for some reason they do redevelop and have higher cost units, there's a requirement that they replace 100% of those units in a lower cost fashion. So we work diligently on that in terms of the protecting existing units. And
So we have enough authority to do
I think we
that?
do. I mean,
Okay.
the policy specifically states that that we are to protect and provide low-cost accommodation. So we work on every, that is a huge part of what we're looking at. And in my mind right now is the Dana Point example that we provided as a case study, which has there was an existing hotel there. It was required in the LCP to be a low-cost accommodation. It was more actually of a moderate cost because we didn't put their rates weren't included in the LCP, as we're not allowed to do that. So it was, but as part of that negotiation on the new hotel that wanted to go in, we had a lot of authority to go in and say, okay, there was this low cost or a moderate cost existing hotel, and we need to protect that. And so I think with the package that we got in large part, it relied very heavily on the protecting part as much as it also provided new programs and other things to add to that benefit.
Okay, and then one other question is, so if, and then kind of in reference to what I was talking about, how camping areas are turning into glamping areas, do we have the authority? So if something goes from 45 bucks a night to 175 bucks a night, is that a change of intensity of use, or is there a hook for the commission to look at, monitor those rates? Because that definitely affects the ability of the public to access those sites.
I think there's usually also some development related to changing those to be a little bit more fancy, I guess. And so that's one of the hooks that we would look to. Also, if there are already provisions on that site, if they needed a permit, we can look to those as well. And that really gets us back to enforcement of these things is always an issue. It doesn't matter in what form it comes in, enforcing the lower cost is something that is quite a challenge for us.
So, yeah, I was thinking it's an enforcement, and if we have sufficient resources to really look, to focus on rates.
That's the challenge, in that we're not, we don't set rates, we're not allowed to set rates, and yet we have these requirements to provide low-cost accommodation. And so how to do that in a manner that doesn't get us afoul of not being able to set rates is a challenge. And I think we've really worked hard to find the middle ground there to describe, for example, how you define low-cost accommodation. And the rubric you saw earlier, that was developed several years ago, that we've sort of used that going forward, and that's helped us a lot. But it is, it's a challenge. I would argue too, with the conversion idea from campgrounds, even if there isn't a specific construction element to a project, it would change the nature of the public access, and we might have a hook there. But it's a good question and something we pay attention to. It's the same thing we have looked at with like parking rates for State Park or other parking lots on the coast that provide public access. So we also look at those and pay close attention to how those rates are increasing, and again, what type of public access is available and what type is being prohibited, or at least that creates a barrier to certain access from certain folks.
Well, that's all I have, except I just want to appreciate how diligent and thoughtful the staff is in trying to push as far as possible to get more low-cost visitor serving available on site. And I think from my observation, we've been increasingly successful in that, and applicants are hearing that. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and thank you. A lot of that is thanks to your efforts. So.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Herman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too really appreciate the effort. This is a really complex area of negotiation. And I think, I'm gonna try to phrase this correctly. So on this slide, I think in a vacuum, I am 100% supportive of this prioritization and the mix and the way that it's laid out. In the ideal world, I would always want on-site all the time. I continue to struggle with the reality of the fact that we cannot income qualify visitors. And so it bothers me deeply when we have on-site affordable accommodations that anyone, regardless of income level, can utilize that low-cost room. And I know for a fact, because truthfully, I have done it. I know higher income folks have done it. You go on a website to book a room, you get the cheapest one. And I've never seen it, and hopefully it's there. Maybe this is something we can think about doing, if we could put or require a disclaimer on the lower cost rooms saying these are intended for lower income visitors, or something to indicate that this is not for the general public. That would help me, but I just don't feel that we are serving our intended purpose by having lower cost rooms that anyone can use. And we all know, practically speaking, that you pick the cheapest room, unless you're of an income bracket where you want the suite, or you truly don't care, or, I mean, there are some exceptions, but the general public, including those of middle-class incomes or higher socioeconomic status, typically are going to choose the cheapest room unless there's some reason not to. So for me, I really struggle with prioritizing on-site accommodations to the detriment of projects that have other really, really good positive elements. So let's take an example where there may be affordable housing that's also being built in concert with a hotel, but we hold it up because we want the on-site accommodations. Well, I can't help but feeling like these interests are in conflict for me, because on the one hand, yeah, I want it on site, but are we really serving low income visitors to the coast? I don't actually think that we are. Maybe once in a while it works out, but I can't say with any certainty that across the board it's having the intended effect. So and again, I think I'm typically sort of the only one in this place when we have these conversations, but I actually would rather, I think, thinking pragmatically about what we're legally allowed to do and legally allowed to require, and our resources for enforcing these things, and understanding who is utilizing these rooms. I would rather jack up the in-lieu fee and have way more campsites built, way more hostels built. Like, I understand sort of the thinking behind on-site, but and again, theoretically, I support it, but practically, I don't think the outcome is where we really want to be. I think if we want to have truly lower cost, available resources for folks on the coast, we would be better off, at least for some period of time, to get these offsite resources built, that we would have a better handle on them actually being utilized by the folks that we want to utilize them. So, you know, I'm not sure that's necessarily a popular position up here on the commission, but my interest is in making sure that we actually serve the people that we want to serve with this policy. And I continue to be concerned that prioritizing on-site to the exclusion of the others may not have the intended effect.
Could I just ask that if you're going to respond to Commissioner Harmon's comments, which I think a lot of us share this concern, it's extremely frustrating. I really appreciated your articulate expression of that, like normal. Could you talk about whether there's a legislative fix potentially?
Yeah, I'd love to respond, and I also appreciate the way you were able to articulate that. I think we as staff completely agree and struggle with some of the same challenges. And it's one of the reasons maybe you've noticed we have really tried to also been focusing on programs and getting more and more programs as part of a package, so that, for example, they're offering, you know, if there's whether it's onsite or offsite, you know, a package to a underserved community to bring families out to the coast on a yearly program or something. That's just one example, but we've really been trying to include those because I think it reaches the intended audiences better than, as you are noting, just putting a low cost room. I mean, I think we've learned a little bit too from some of the examples we've had in the past year that sticking, you know, really focusing just on-site doesn't always work, and it doesn't necessarily serve us depending on what the goals of a particular project are. And we've seen more of these joint projects recently where you have housing and hotels or other accommodations all together in one project. It makes it a little more complicated. But that's why we kind of pose this as a prioritization, not as a strict, you know, because I think we did, like in Santa Monica as an example, move to the, you know, in lieu fee, we did have a hostel that needed funding to create, you know, do the expansion. And so that really worked out well. It didn't need to be on site. But we have some examples like in Dana Point where on site made a lot of sense and we were able to work it through. So we need to be flexible. And it depends on the project. That's what I was saying. So we need to go site specifically and kind of think through the details and the challenges associated with each of those projects. But yeah, your point is well taken. And I in terms of a legislative fix, I'm going to need to think about that a little bit more. I have because I think, you know, again, we're not allowed to set room rates specifically. But you know, anything that we can think of collectively to reach the audiences that we're intending to reach, folks that are of lower income that we want to provide access to the coast, I think that would be a great outcome if we can brainstorm, or if there's other ideas you all have on how we can better do that in addition to the things we're doing so far, because I think that's what we all want.
Well, you know, Kate, Dr. Huckabridge, you know, park entities, state parks and local regional parks now have all these programs for lower cost park passes, and it's all tied to either SSI benefits or other public benefits, which is a proof. You know, you either have a letter from SSI or you have proof that you're receiving public benefits. So, I mean, to me, that is something that could be incorporated in legislation. You know, it could be that in order to reserve these rooms, you know, if you can show that you're receiving, you know, CalFresh or other public benefits. I mean, that's at the kind of a one level, but not that low level. As a matter of fact, I mean, a lot of people receive that are not, that we would want to have access to the room. So go ahead, Commissioner Harmon. I just want to throw that out.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just as a follow-up on that point, I think that legislatively that would solve the problem that I'm getting at. But and as an interim fix, and maybe this is a question for our general counsel, would we have the ability as a part of a condition for a lower cost room to require some kind of statement that says what the intention for this room is? Thinking about myself and how I operate, if I were to see a statement on a room rate that said this is intended for a lower cost visitor, I wouldn't book that room. And it's not going to solve the problem, but there may be some people that respect the intention. Is that something that we could require while maybe we think about a legislative solution?
So I think we can certainly require signage and that kind of thing. And so I would imagine we could also do something on a website. We'd have to think about the right wording so that we're not sort of suggesting that we're looking at the income of the people who would book the room. But yeah, I think there's probably a way to have some sort of informational signage effectively. That's a good creative idea. I think Ms. Gray also wanted to respond to your initial question as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we do really need to get creative on this. Obviously, we have our limitations, and truly, regardless of which option we take, offsite, onsite, in lieu fees, getting to that target demographic is difficult. So how do we do that? Do we, choose options that possibly are inherently more lower cost, like having a hostel on site or getting the money to campgrounds? And we've also, used some newer strategies in some of our approvals. And I think it would be helpful if I can turn it over to Mr. Amate to just talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of the latest information on background on marketing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been really trying to take seriously, in our different approvals has been marketing and engagement plans, right? So we've been doing that as, conditions of approval of projects or in LCPAs, different suggested amounts for that. And so these marketing and engagement plans typically, they make advertising and marketing available both online and in person. So we do have that aspect, and we ask that those marketing engagement plans distribute advertising and marketing materials beyond the immediate area to neighboring communities, just in general, greater regional area and statewide. And we always ask that, non-English languages also be included, and that they're culturally relevant. We make sure that it's widely distributed. And we also are thinking about, identifying additional actions that could be taken. In some cases, we could advertise that there's specific programming, or maybe there's, I'm thinking of the Hermosa Beach example where there was discounts for coming in without a car and using public transportation. So those sorts of additional amenities or opportunities are also advertised. So these marketing and engagement plans are typically prior to issuance of a permit, or they're done through an LCP amendment. So that helps us weigh in, and we typically involve our environmental justice unit and our staff and the different communities to really come up with these great plans. And then when the hotel operators, they come in and they do these things, we closely coordinate with them. And if they don't do that, then enforcement staff usually goes after that. So that's typically the best way we've been able to really get at the core of this issue.
And I think, again, that's maybe a vehicle to think through some of the ideas you've just presented about, could there be some sort of notice or something provided, both in marketing materials out to the targeted audience, but also to others who might benefit from a room that wasn't intended for them. And we have Sarah Christie, my legislative director on the line. So I thought we would kick it over to her and see if she has any ideas about if there's any, legislative potential concepts we might want to think about. Thanks so much, Ms. Christie.
Thanks, Kate, and good morning. I think it's still morning, Chair and Commissioners. There was some interest just before the COVID pandemic shut everything down in a bill that would have actually removed the prohibition on the commission setting roommates. As I recall, it was Assemblymember Friedman who was interested in introducing that bill. It wasn't an idea that came from us, but they did run the language by us. And unfortunately, when COVID shut the Capitol down, only essential COVID related bills ran that session. And so I don't believe that bill ever saw the light of day, but there was some initial interest in potentially, addressing the prohibition on the commission's ability to set room rates, sorry. But that's not necessarily the only solution, and I don't even know that would necessarily get at Commissioner Harmon's concern. So if this is something that the commission is interested in looking at, we can definitely, have some discussions maybe with the legislative committee over the interim and see if there is a potential way to improve the outcomes through a legislative fix.
Thanks so much, Ms. Christie. And I mean, I do think it goes hand in hand with the affordable housing issue. So as we're moving forward to discuss that topic with the legislature, I think that this is both of these things are so critically important at the coast. All right. Commissioner Turnbull Sanders, are you done, Commissioner Harmon? Okay.
Thank you. I think this goes to a similar question about a legislative fix, and maybe Ms. Christie can explain this a little bit more to better understand. Working on the local government level, you have the transit occupancy tax. And that's usually, I think, like around 12% or something like that. It's kind of sacrosanct and it's the third rail. So I don't know if there are any city council members watching, but they usually don't want it. It's usually usually a hands-off kind of situation. But my question goes to the overlap between what local jurisdictions may require and what we require. And so are there instances where local jurisdictions, whether it's tied to TOT or whether it's tied to some other local policy, like maybe it's in their, I don't know, their housing element or something like that, where there is a requirement for low cost overnight accommodations that are, I guess, temporary or visitor serving. And has there been any attempt by the commission to work with local jurisdictions in that regard? So looking at maybe more of a local fix rather than a state kind of fix. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what our LCPs do. This is exactly, we have that conversation with every local government, usually focus on the LCP because that's our own jurisdiction. And it's where those local policies that the local government comes in with, depending on which local government you're talking and how that overlaps with the Coastal Act requirements for low cost accommodation. So we do have those conversations very regularly, and it looks really different, I think. I mean, that's in every local government, because they all approach it differently. They have different dynamics in their communities, different needs. So I don't have like an answer but just to say we have those conversations all the time with local governments, especially if this issue is on the table. We just included a low cost accommodation policy that was approved yesterday for the city of San Diego and on their one community plan. So again, it comes up all the time, and we're constantly revisiting with local governments the best way to achieve the Coastal Act requirements and do it in a way that that local government achieves whatever their whole suite of goals that they have for their communities. So it's a balance.
Can I just tell you one thing about that? It's just so on point. I know I'm totally out of order probably with my continual comments on this, and I hope that you all will excuse me. That's it. What can I say? No, I mean, in Sonoma County, when I was Parks Director, they there was a big push to force us to charge more for our park camping and entry fees to pay for fire department because they said, well, emergency response, we're responding to the coast, all the parks. Therefore, you need to charge more TOT that would then go to us. So that's kind of a flip. And that is something we do need to address in our LCPs to prevent that from happening, where they take these affordable overnight accommodations and ramp it up with TOT. Local, you see what you all see what I'm, so I just wanted to mention that.
Just have one thing to add to that. There is also a recent bill that was passed and went into effect just July 1st, SB 478, that requires all fees to include the mandatory taxes or other fees that are imposed by a local government in the fee that is being marketed. So we would want to work with hotel developers on ensuring that the lower cost rates are inclusive of those TOT fees. We also included language on this in the Magnolia Tank Farm action yesterday.
So one thing maybe to also consider is, I know that in the past we've had these convenings with local legislators. So we would bring, city council members, supervisors at kind of that local level together to have more conversations about that and see what kind of best practices and what cities are doing it well and others maybe can learn from them potentially. The other question I had was about really the formula for adjusting for inflation and looking at Los Angeles and some areas, construction costs have been going up like 20 or 30%. So looking at how do we account for those kinds of projections, right? Which may not be accurately reflected in a general kind of inflation index, but specifically with construction costs. So we looked at, the slide that showed, $150,000 a room, but that didn't include land costs and probably other entitlement, all of those kinds of things. So I think just kind of keeping that in mind. And I think we're in a similar situation with other entities that may have community benefits agreements where we hold, or the Conservancy holds these in lieu fees. And then by the time we have a project, the costs have escalated so much that it doesn't have a good return on investment. So I think in the past, we've also had some specific examples of how those funds were spent down. The presentation today was really good in terms of giving the examples of some of the places that have been able to use the in lieu fees. But it seems like, we always hear of like Crystal Cove, that Santa Monica Mountains campground, kind of little funky hotel kind of, and the Santa Monica hostel. But if we could kind of see really dollars that were allocated and then what did they actually go to, like in terms of dollar amounts, I think that would be helpful. And it may also shine a light for local representatives and local jurisdictions to understand and to have those kind of conversations with developers about why it's so important to kind of capture these fees. And that because I think we get feedback sometimes that we're just kind of making things up as we go. And so to really have that kind of projection so that we have concrete examples of why we need to increase the in lieu fees, I think would be helpful for our own kind of standing in terms of our reputation and our ability to say, hey, this is the way that we do things, and also add some predictability into the market in terms of developer costs and anticipating what those would be. Thank you, Commissioner Turnbull Sanders. Just wanted to make one quick comment to that. We've been actively working with the Conservancy, Coastal Conservancy, on this issue. We kind of partner on this. Often our in lieu fees, they use our in lieu fees to fund low cost accommodation. And so it may make sense at some point in the future to have the Conservancy staff come and do something of a briefing for you all on, they are intimately familiar with all the challenges of actually building low cost accommodation, whether it's a campground or a hostel, because that's part of their job. They do it all the time. And we have been collaborating and trying to come up with ways to move this forward. Because as you said, part of the challenge we've had is it's really hard to build these projects for a number of reasons. Even finding an operator, somebody, a developer, operator who wants to do that can be challenging. Excuse me. So I think which is why the funds then sit for a while, because it takes a while. And then by the time we have a project, the funds aren't enough because, costs have gone up. So that's sort of what brought us to this challenge and why we went kind of then swung focusing a little bit more on onsite, because that's how felt like we could actually get something in place. So, but all the comments here today, I think that if we could figure out a more efficient way or a better model for actually getting low cost accommodation through our in lieu fees, I think that is a benefit for everybody. And so thinking through how to do that effectively. And part of that is increasing a fee. Part of that is identifying projects, working better together. For us, we would permit those projects as an example. So all this to say, I think it would be useful maybe to walk through some examples, as you suggest, of the challenges, but, including some successes, what's worked and what hasn't worked, from the Conservancy, who, again, this is what they do. So we'll take that under consideration for the next time this comes up. Next time we can bring it in front of you and do another briefing.
Thank you.
Just one more last thing, just picking up on what Commissioner Harmon was saying about advertising the low-cost accommodations and marketing them towards population that really need the discounted rates most. And I never really quite understood how marketing works, right? How, if, we have conditions in our staff report that say something like, you shall market to low income communities or something. And I don't know how that exactly works, but one thing to consider potentially is also linking some of this up with our whale tail grants or education programs. So like using those groups that may have more of a propensity to work with youth or families that would, because they've been exposed through whatever nature programs or conservation programs, and use them to kind of be a point of outreach, and maybe just include that as something, as a condition within the grant. And then that way it's a little bit more targeted, because otherwise I don't know how you market, like, how does that work? Or how do you market to communities that are going to go to the beach and take advantage of it?
It's a great idea.
Thank you so much. Great ideas. Commissioner Wilson?
Well, first I want to, we're kind of nipping at the edges of kind of a bigger issue. And I mean, frankly, this is a wealth income gap issue, and it's just growing. And so we're just in this weird place where we're supposed to try and address one small piece of that legislatively from the past. It's just weird. And it's really class warfare, and it's real in terms of land use, in terms of pricing. I don't use that term lightly, because it's just and here we are trying to like fix it on the edges, and it's just getting, and we know just from the national policies and in terms of how wealth is expanding to the 1%. And I know these seem like trite terms these days, but when all 50% of new wealth goes up and then everybody else kind of scrambles for the bottom, now we're trying to deal with that on the coast for people's like vacations and recreation. It's just so weird to me. So that being said, putting all that aside, I mean, I just think that's just the reality of that. And it's strange that this act and this commission has been put in this position to try and deal with just one small piece of that much bigger issue. That being said, I agree with much of what Commissioner Harmon has said here today, because the first time I experienced this discussion was really for the shores, and I had a hotel, and I had a really uncomfortable. I mean, I voted no on that one because I didn't. There was a big push by the commission to I felt like shoehorn lower income people into this very posh place. Thank you for the word, and while there was an alternative to, to do something offsite and and in terms of hosteling, and I've done much hosteling in my time, and I hear the person that spoke earlier about not being able to afford hotels. It's true. I make more than probably your average person working in a hotel, but there are many things we permit that I could never afford to go to, and there are numerous commissioners here who are in the same place, and so have some empathy towards that a bit, and so I want to. If we have these resources and we want to be more proactive, it seems like we have this fund, and I'm not sure how we staff that that action of trying to get that fund utilized. And I agree with the longer we hold the fund, the less value it has to a certain degree. And so what I was hoping to get to was, can we, from that fund, programmatically try to actively solicit proposals by which, throughout the state that would actually move these things in the right direction. So that's one question I have. I think, and I think maybe even a subcommittee of the commission might be helpful to help kind of drive that a little bit. Kind of like we have the housing subcommittee or the legislative sub. I mean, and so there's like this resource that I feel is, and I don't want to, I'm trying not to be critical, but I feel like it's a little inactive. Maybe I'm just not seeing it. That's also happens a lot with me, and in times be like, don't you know that? No. So I just want to put that out there. I do, and the program that I think that Commissioner Hart is referring to is the Golden Bear Pass, and I was looking at that. And it's sort of limited, and maybe there is something legislatively that could be created to sort of expand upon the concept of the Golden Bear Pass that could be used, that people could use to access some of these things. I apologize for jumping all over the place. One thing I also think would be interesting, and maybe, something that, and this is just me free forming here. The Unite folks, maybe it's like airline people who work for airlines get to fly on airlines, right? And so maybe there could be programmatically people who work in hotels have access to hotels, right? And so something to that, something that we could help formulate in terms of so the workforce within these industries within the coastal zone have some access to the amenities that they help create. And that's my stream of consciousness for now.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. That was great. Commissioner Bochco, do you have any comments on this topic? All right, Commissioner Rice.
Thank you. That's a great idea, I think.
That is a good.
And those airline, though, they let you go on other flights at different places, so it wouldn't necessarily have them to be even linked to the very hotel you work in.
Well, I was thinking like within the unionized hotels.
Yeah, no, cool.
Yeah.
So I think this is really complicated, and it is we're trying to address something that Supervisor Wilson referred to as going to become more and more challenging. I just wanted to focus in on just a couple of other ideas, more along the lines of making sure that what rooms are available at lower rates or what accommodations are available at lower rates actually are linked up with people, the target audience, as it were. And then also making sure that they're being utilized. And I do think every situation is a little different depending on the project and the location. But I'm thinking about the obvious user groups in a different way. And I think we did this with one project. There are organizations locally that community-based organizations that are likely to have a clientele that is going to fit the income bracket and or the target audience for whatever reason, however you want to define it. And I'm thinking that that's an outreach place in terms of connecting. And also the local jurisdictions, parks and rec, local rec organizations, and not so much even the private stuff, but usually the public rec departments and those programs are catering to a lower income clientele. And there's families there. So I'm thinking of who are the trusted partners locally? And then towards, have we, do we use vouchers? Have we, I'm thinking about, frankly, our housing authorities and vouchers. It's a way of subsidizing, right? Rental, your rent. Could these hotels that have promised a certain number of rooms, certain number of days, whatever, at certain rates, actually create vouchers for those that then are distributed to our trusted partners who are dealing with, I don't know if that's a possibility, but I hate the idea of folks who can actually afford a higher rate, taking advantage of the lower rate rooms. And I also really don't like the idea of these lower rate rooms just not being utilized and the hotel operator just being able to rent them out at a higher rate because they didn't have any takers. Anyway, so those are actually the only things that came up new for me, but I do think it's this linking that's important in terms of what's there. But then the larger problem is not only preservation, but actually expanding what is available, the stock, as it were, whether it's hotels, whether it's camping, what have you. And I would support Commissioner Wilson's idea about how can we be more proactive with those in lieu fees that are banking away.
I can just respond super quickly to that. I'm sorry. On the question of how to get those in lieu fees that are utilized, we do have the AB 250 authority to redirect those fees if they've gone unspent after 7 years. There are several pots of funds that meet that bill. So we are actively looking at that and options of where they could go. We best do that through quarterly meetings with state parks and Coastal Conservancy that staff attends, where we talk about what those viable projects are and how to kind of funnel those funds that are available through the state parks opportunities and the Conservancy's grant program.
All right, thank you.
Chair, can I just follow up with a question related to that? Is there a way to expand that to local governments too? Because if
Yeah.
we're just limiting it to state parks, maybe the pool of opportunity is quite small. Thank you.
Yeah, all coastal park. And thanks so much, Commissioner Wilson. That's a great point. Commissioner Lone.
So Commissioner Harmon, you've given me a great deal to think about, so I really appreciate your view and your lens on this. My concern is, and I've watched this in San Francisco, where they set up the in lieu fees for housing, for affordable housing. And what the dynamic that was created then it's similar to the extent that we don't have we have just a certain amount of land that we can deal with, like San Francisco, 7 by 7. So what's got set up in San Francisco is now you've got nonprofit housing developers competing with for-profit housing developers, and all it did was drive up the cost of the initial purchase of that property. And I get concerned about not having it on site, that you create this competition for a few sites, for an X number of sites in the state. So I just want to lay that out there as part of the conundrum that we're facing here. The other thing that I've watched over the years, I'm not saying it happens across the board, but it tends to for-profit developers, because of greed and needing to have return on investment, where that's not as important to nonprofit developers. It's a different matrix because their lending is different, all the numbers change. The efficiencies that a for-profit developer achieves are greater, typically. I'm not saying it's 100%, but over the years, I've just watched, when you look at per door, when you create housing, whether it be, short-term rental or whatever it might be, the efficiencies to have it on site tend to lower the cost per unit, let's say. because it just is, for whatever reason. Also when yesterday during the hearing, when I asked the nonprofit housing, the woman that came before us, I said, what about maintaining? Because now what we're finding, at least in San Francisco, is in places like the Tenderloin, the nonprofit housing developments are just falling apart because there's nobody, I mean, it was like, do it now, get it up, get people in, but now it's 15, 20 years and roofs and paint on the outside, and the units themselves have become so tattered and worn. And so it is a conundrum. So I just lay it out there. It's something we all need to think about. And I really appreciate it, Director Hucklebridge, that we really need to be flexible. And if there is, like with the tin can thing, when there's the ability to say, wait a minute, right here on site, Mr. Ms. Developer, you can do it here and, push that lever. I just think the efficiencies are much better, but I really appreciate that we need to be incredibly flexible when it comes and look at each one individually. And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. I just don't see that at all. Throwing out one thing that someone brought up, how do we keep up with costs? You may want to look at the insurance industry. So the insurance industry publishes every year, or maybe it's every other year. You'll have to check how often they do it, but they publish, there's like a guidebook on replacement costs for, and we're sort of, if you own, when you're in the world of owning real estate and you need to conform, you can't just arbitrarily say, well, it'll cost me $100 a square foot, when really the number's 150 and you're only insuring for 100. So insurance companies have kind of gotten smart about this, and they're forcing for-profit commercial owners to really insure for the actual cost, which means insurance premiums are going up. But they do publish a book. They publish, I don't know if it's a book, but they publish these schedules of construction. And it might be good to take a look at that because they do keep up with it's not an inflation number. Inflation, even at its height was what, 8, 9%, when construction costs were going up 25, 30%. So to look at inflation, it's a false number when it comes to construction. I'm just an anecdote. For years, the cost of sheet plywood, the cheapest plywood that you would put it in a subfloor was $29 a sheet forever. It's 95 now. I mean, you can get it for 90, but the average is really, we're calculating now 95. So if you can find somebody to like undercut their competitor for 90, you're like, yeah. But the cost of construction has just gone through the roof. But there are mechanisms out there, and I would look at the insurance industry because they're really, they're pretty keen on keeping up with the costs of rebuild. And I think it might be a good way to look at it. But again, I go back to, look, this is a total conundrum because you don't want to set up, the for-profit person is always going to pay a little bit more than the nonprofit. So you're constantly going to be behind the 8 ball. And 7 years, I mean, 7 years, it's such a long period of time when you talk about inflation and numbers and what things can buy, that it worries me that $7 7 years ago, you're going to get pennies on the dollar for new development. And that's a toughie. But you've given me a lot to think about, Commissioner Harmon, and I do appreciate it's a push me, pull you. So.
Those are great thoughts. Thanks. Commissioner Eckerl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just also want to echo my thanks to staff for the thoughtful presentation. It was incredibly helpful. And I appreciate the perspectives and the conversation amongst my fellow commissioners. I have a process question and then some responses to what I've heard. Is this something that will ultimately become a policy of the commission? Will this discussion inform something that comes back to us? Or is this just direction to staff to help inform decision-making and recommendations going forward? And I ask that question to put a finer point on something that Commissioner Turnbull Sanders said, and that is, I think it's really important to provide clear expectations and transparency for what the commission is going to require. and providing guardrails, and that there's flexibility, that we're going to be doing site-specific analysis, that we have a standard, but that we're going to be flexible as we think about those things. So curious about process on that piece.
So right now, this is informational. There is not an intent at this moment to come back with something for adoption by the commission. But that is, that's part of what we maybe are looking for feedback on, is what direction should we take on this? Obviously, we look case by case. And so you've seen elements of what we're talking about already through various projects, right? So that's sort of been our practice. But if there was a strong desire or an interest from the commission to see something a little bit more, boiled down, that we could then take more formal action on, we could certainly consider that. So up for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Huckelberg. And I think I want to hear from the commission and staff what is most useful, right? Like, I think the transparency piece for the public is important. I also want to, protect staff in the negotiations and conversations as we're evaluating these projects. I also want to appreciate the recommendation for the Coastal Conservancy to come back. I had a conversation with Dr. Huckelbridge and the director of the Coastal Conservancy probably several months ago on this issue, and I had many of the same questions about particularly the in lieu fee pipeline and how we're identifying and prioritizing those projects. So I would appreciate that presentation. And then finally, on the comment about the redirection of the funds, I think, was that AB 250? Can you provide, do we have flexibility on the types of projects that we use for that redirection? Or are they still specifically for, the concept of low cost accommodation?
Thanks for that question. The AB 250 language does require consistency with the underlying permit condition, so it may depend on what the permit condition states. We do try to draft those fairly broadly, though, to provide for construction of new overcost overnight accommodations, within the county that the hotel project was taking place in, for example.
Great, but we don't use those funds for broader public access.
No, it's usually, as Brittany noted, it's broadly defined, and then it's not a project specific, but it's more defined in terms of the type of project that can be funded. So it's an overnight accommodation in this particular region. We couldn't, generally in most cases, couldn't take those funds and use it for a different type of public access.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Aguirre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just appreciate the conversation and all the comments that my colleagues have mentioned so far, and the presentation as well. I want to associate myself with Commissioner Harmon's idea of having a disclosure messaging. I think that's super important. I also support the idea of a legislative fix for room rate setting. I think, for any program that we offer statewide or locally, you have to, at a certain point, show your degree of income. I'm a strong supporter of on-site. And I think I really want to thank the caller who dialed in, took their time out of their day to call us, because I think it really showcases, the reality for a lot of people. Right. And I do appreciate also the ability to have, off-site accommodations, but traditionally, culturally, there are many communities that aren't familiar or able or willing or, open to going camping, for example, right? I'm thinking about my own culture. It's not very common to do that. And why not? Why not give folks who clean and maintain and work in these beautiful hotels the ability to stay there? So I really like the idea of if there's a potential for partnership with unions. This is something that I think, have signaled to developers that come before us that's an element that's very important to us, that they work with labor and the workforce. So I think that could be another potential opportunity for that. And then lastly, I'll just mention, I did go on our website to look at how can people find out an inventory of, what is available out there. I think that's a big challenge, right? People unfamiliar with, oh, I wouldn't even know to go to the Coastal Commission website, right? And I did notice we have the latest projects for 2024, but I'm wondering if there's a possibility to maybe even create an app or something where we can have a comprehensive list and that's up to date. I don't know if that's, I see you're nodding your head, Brittany, you might have thought of that, I don't know.
We do have some information on our website about the commission required on-site lower cost overnight accommodations. I believe we have an app specific to other types of public access, and we could absolutely look into
I think that would be
integrating this.
helpful. Just make it as easy as possible. People, especially people who are not tech savvy, you know, so anyway. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share thoughts.
All right, great. Well, I just want to thank everyone for all these really very thoughtful comments and just great comments. I just have a few points I wanted to make. First of all, I want to say that with regard to some of the locations that we identified, I mean, already today we talked about flying flags as not being affordable. And that just points to the challenge of enforcement. But, you know, I was really happy. I looked at Ventana because I was down there not that long ago and I went through their campground, which is really cool. And I was very happy to see it was $80. So, you know, I think that for a campground where you can have 4 or more people, and that's generally, it's such a, and it's an area that's so exclusive with a couple hotels. I was really happy to see that. But again, we need to figure out this enforcement challenge. And again, it returns to, you know, the legislature. One of the things that I encountered, again, going back to when I was Parks Director, is, you know, we developed this idea of these cabins with state parks. It was part of State Parks Forward. But then when it came to actually having the parks on, and at Doran, we were looking at, which is a regional park in Sonoma County, we hit up against the then, you know, I was obviously not on the commission then, but the challenges of the commission permitting process. So one of the things we have to look at is, because those tiny cabins are only 20,000 each, and they're on wheels. I mean, they're really a practical solution on the coast. And it also addresses something that you talked about, Commissioner Geary. A lot of people either don't feel comfortable camping, they don't have camping equipment. You know, it's just not something that they do. It's not traditional in their culture. But cabins, on the other hand, you know, they're easier for ADA, you know, you can make them ADA. So I think incorporating into our permitting approach an openness toward these sort of low-cost accommodations in both state and regional parks. And I couldn't agree more with Commissioner Wilson that we need to expand. You know, all of LA parks, for example, are operated by, or you know, many of the LA state parks are operated by the city. So we just stick with meetings with state parks. We're not going to be able to make a lot of progress there. There's a lot of parks that are run by local entities. Okay, let me just see. So I talked about enforcement. I sent to you, Dr. Hucklebridge, as well as to Sarah and Sean, the what we developed in Sonoma County. We created this vehicle entry pass, which was a way that low-income people could qualify. So I sent you that, and it's not just SSI. There's a whole list of eligibility criteria. I'm thinking that we could incorporate it into legislation. Happy to send it to anyone else, or you can just go on the Sonoma County Regional Parks that lists all of the different criteria that you can get, basically a $5 entry fee. So same way, we could create a voucher program where people that have that proof have vouchers. And, you know, it's the same way with rentals. We're all familiar with it that work in county and city governments. People have vouchers to pay their rent. Why can't people have vouchers to pay for hotel rooms that qualify? So these are the kinds of things that I think we really need to be aggressive in looking into and thinking outside of the box. You know, one thing I want to say, though, about that I am a little frustrated, when we did that Ocean Avenue project, and we really stepped up and required those additional fees for that hostel, subsequent to that hearing, there was huge pushback from Unite Here. So when I heard the individual speaking today, and I recalled that situation, that really bothers me. So we need to be on the same page here, folks. When we're pushing for additional low-cost housing as part of a project, we need to be with our union allies. When we're supporting a project and then the developer puts up more money, in this case for a hostel, which was the deal with the Ocean Avenue project, then we need to be applauded for that. We all need to be on the same team. So that was something that happened that I just wanted to mention. Going forward, I think we need to make sure that we're all on the same page on these projects. Also on STRs, I mean, that's the final thing. I don't think that we can go too far on this, folks. I think we have to find a balance because STRs sometimes can be the only thing that people can afford. If it's, a large family, we want to make sure that we don't make it so impossible for people to find short-term rentals. I'm just worried that that we get so antagonistic toward one thing, and then we go, we sort of go back and forth. And I really feel with SDRs, there has to be a balance, and I feel like we did that in Marin. So those are all my comments, and just want to appreciate everyone here and give everyone the good news that it's time for lunch.